Constance and the Martyrs of Memphis, Yellow Fever, 1878. In 1878, Memphis was a boom town. It had grown to a respectable population of 48,000 less than 60 years after its founding. Money was flowing through what at the time was the South's second largest city. Its unique position on the Mississippi River and halfway between St. Louis and New Orleans meant it was a distribution hub for the Deep South's crops like cotton. The Industrial Revolution had struck, and with it had come European immigrants in search of a chance at wealth. Culture was in abundance as the exotic foods of the Irish, Italians, Germans, and other immigrants blended with the regional dishes of the recently liberated slaves and farming families of Shelby County. The air was rich with music. Jubilee singing melded with accordion and fiddles and arias. The yellow fever epidemic of 1873 had only claimed 528 Memphian lives, which was a relatively low number when compared to New Orleans' early outbreak in 1853, which killed 7,849 residents. This was the year that Caroline Louise Darling, who went by the name Constance after taking her vows into the sisterhood, stepped off the train at Calhoun Station. Sister Constance was a 28-year-old nun from St. Mary's Convent in upstate New York. She had been chosen by her mother superior to run a school for girls in Memphis. She was joined by a gentle young nun, Sister Thecla McMahon, and together they would establish St. Mary's School. Constance and Thecla were embraced by the community for their efforts to help the poor, the ill, and the orphaned. A wave of yellow fever hit the girls' school where Constance was headmistress the year she arrived, but under her watchful eye, only 2 of the 40 yellow fever victims she tended died. She was praised and celebrated for preventing so many deaths, but the worst was still to come. Yellow fever is transmitted by infected mosquitoes to humans. Those affected would vomit black blood. Blood would pour from every orifice. Victims would often hallucinate from high fever associated with the disease. The name yellow fever came from its most telling symptoms: yellowed skin and eyes. Prior to the invention of antipyretics such as aspirin, the survival rate was a mere 20%. There is still no known cure for yellow fever. In 1878, a steamboat worker from New Orleans stopped at a Memphis restaurant owned by Kate Bionda. The sailor wasn't feeling well and sought a bit of respite. It was soon discovered the customer was an escapee of a quarantined steamboat. He had single-handedly brought the fever back into Memphis. Within days, Kate Bionda was dead. Memphis went to work, warning citizens to look out for symptoms and distributing carbolic acid, an antibacterial substance. Doctors did not know the true culprits of yellow fever were mosquitoes. It was a virus spread from the insect to its victim only. People opened windows, hoping the fresh air would clear any fever out of their homes, but they were unaware that they had just invited the disease right into their world. After Kate's death had been confirmed as yellow fever, one Memphian after another fell sick. Everyone with any money or a place to go fled the city. They rode off in packed carriages, crowded rail cars, or they left on foot when no other transportation was to be had. 25,000 residents left in 1 week. Sister Constance and Sister Thecla had left Memphis for a brief summer holiday to New York. The early fever victims were being cared for by Reverend Parsons, Sister Huetta, and Sister Frances. As soon as Constance and Thecla heard about the disease, they boarded the next train to Memphis. When Constance and Thecla stepped off the train, Memphis looked very different from when they had left just weeks prior. The lively city was now a ghost town. Buildings were boarded up. Undertakers dragged carts full of coffins down the empty streets. Constance and Thecla were told they could work within the city by day and that they would be taken to the countryside at night to avoid contracting the fever. The nuns refused to leave the city. Constance vowed to tend to Memphis's ill by night and by day, and that she did. Constance would not rest. She and the other sisters began opening an asylum for the orphaned children of fever victims. They took 40 children to a building that had been granted to them for housing. Seeing this large group approaching, neighborhood men formed a mob and blocked Constance's path. She spoke to them bravely, asking them, wouldn't they want the same for their children when their time came? The men moved aside. Soon, the nuns were overwhelmed by sick to care for. 200 people per day were dying. The nuns would go from house to house bringing broth and tea for the sick, calling undertakers for the dead, calling doctors when there were any to be had, and collecting the orphans. In one letter to Mother Superior of her order in New York, Constance wrote, I telegraphed to you yesterday in great perplexity and with much doubt. They sent us the orphans so fast that we cannot keep them in the one outside room that we dare to use here. And we have taken the Canfield Asylum and are fitting it up roughly for them as a sort of a quarantine house, carrying them over to the home as fast as we dare. They brought in 6 this morning, miserable, dirty little things, one only 10 months old. I send to you at Mr. Harris's and Mr. Parsons' most urgent request, heartily feeling that I ought to take responsibility of asking you to put any more of the community into such certain peril. Still, they will be safer than we all. Everybody is down, I think. Our opposite neighbor, Mr. Holt, is just taken ill, and his son says he's worked too hard to have any chance. He was working with the Howards. Yesterday, I found 2 girls who had spent 2 days in a 2-room cottage with the unburied bodies of their parents, their uncle, in the utmost suffering and delirium, and no one near them but a rough drayman who held the sick man on his bed. It was 24 hours before I could get those 2 fearful corpses buried, and then I had to send for a police officer to the Board of Health before any undertaker would enter the room. Oh, one grows perfectly hardened to these things. Carts with 8 or 9 corpses in rough boxes are ordinary sights. I saw a nurse stop one today and ask for a certain man's residence. The driver just pointed over his shoulder with his whip at the heap of coffins behind him and answered, I've got him in this coffin. In her diary, Constance wrote, Mr. Parsons had a chill this evening. I shall know before 12 whether it was the chill. Reverend Parsons was the first of their group of caregivers to die, but he was not to be the last. Another entry from Constance said, the calls for food and wine are incessant. I've been on my feet almost the whole day. A nurse has just been here to say that he will not stay another night with 2 patients, a father and daughter, if the dead mother is not buried. The body has been there for nearly 2 days, and no undertaker can be found. Who has the time to bring a coffin? We're absolutely forbidden to touch the dead, even if a coffin could be found. The sisters did all they could. They gave every scrap of fabric they were wearing so the dead would have something to be buried in. St. Mary's of New York knew more help was needed. Sister Ruth and Sister Helen were selected to travel to Memphis. Hearing this news, Constance wrote, Your telegram brought me a kind of brightness, but I cannot help but have a great deal of anxiety for Sister Helen and Sister Ruth. My sense of duty in the matter is so divided between the feeling that I ought to secure all the help I can for these poor suffering people, and the fear for those who come. I will guard them to the utmost, but they know, and you know, that they are offering their lives. Shortly after the arrival of Ruth and Helen, Constance and Thecla fell ill. Ruth wrote, Sister Constance and Sister Thecla were taken with the fever the day before yesterday, and Dr. Armstrong told us this morning he has no hope for either one. They're very ill. Mr. Harris is better, Mr. Parsons died this morning. We're helpless and do not know what to do, nor how help can come. There are nearly 50 children here now. We have no clean clothes, and it's utterly impossible to get any washing done. There's no one to send for supplies, and no stores are open. Money's quite useless. There's plenty of money here, but it buys no head to plan, no hands to wash, nor the common necessaries of life. Constance at first refused to accept her illness, claiming it was only a headache, and she tried to stay on her feet, seeing to patients. But soon it was clear to all she would not recover. When offered a mattress, Constance refused, knowing that when she died, the mattress would have to be burned, and there were so few mattresses left. Constance died on the floor, surrounded by flowers that the sisters and children of the orphanage often brought for her. A postcard from Ruth explained, "We did not think that our first letter home would be so sad. Our hearts ache, and we do not have many words, and yet you must all know. Yesterday morning, dear Sister Constance entered into rest about 10 o'clock. She was tired out long before she gave up." Ruth also added, "The city is so desolate. Everyone who is not ill says, 'Oh, it's only a question of time.' Each day we dread news from St. Mary's, and each night we thank God that one more day is gone." Thecla was marked as having said, "Oh, why did you come? I was thinking of heavenly things. I was with Jesus, and you disturbed me." Her death was said to be as gentle as she was. But yellow fever still raged. Shortly before Constance and Thecla's passing, Reverend Schuler had heard of the need and sacrifices of the St. Mary's group, and he offered to join their noble cause. He had only 1 week in Memphis to serve the community before he was stricken. And so was sweet, tender-hearted Ruth. She and Reverend Schuler passed away on the same day. Sister Frances died the next day. One of the sisters at the orphanage wrote, "The children were all so fond of Sister Frances. Charlie goes out by himself to lay flowers on the grave, and stands looking so pitifully upon it. He is the oldest boy of the home." The Nashville, Tennessee newspaper ran a memorial tribute written by the Ladies' Relief to Constance and her falling sisters. Her noble labors among the poor and orphaned and in the schools before the fatal pestilence of the summer broke out are such as we may well remember long with gratitude. But her heroic return to her post after the fever began to rage in the face of such dreadful danger, her unremitting toil for the sick, the dying and the dead amidst the wars which we at the distance can but imagine, we feel we are beyond all common words of praise. While we give thanks for the good example of our sister, for her beautiful life crowned by a martyr's death, we rejoice that here on high with the divine master she will be, whose footsteps she so closely followed. To her sisters Thecla, Frances, and Ruth, and to all those who count not their lives dear unto them while ministering to their suffering fellow men in his name, we seem clearly to hear him say, "Inasmuch as you have done it unto one of the least of these, my brethren, you have done it unto me." The Martyrs of Memphis, as the nuns of St. Mary's were to be known, were buried at the Elmwood Cemetery in Memphis, Tennessee, where many visit each year to pay their respects to the remarkable and selfless women. As the fall of 1878 drew to a close, over 17,000 people in Memphis had contracted yellow fever in a matter of 3 months, and a vast number of those were not to recover. The construction of a sewer system in Memphis in 1880 helped to prevent future outbreaks.